Hey everybody, I'm Chris Thompson, and this is session number 3 of Brain Software with Dr. Mike Mandel, the man who has been called the Garry Kasparov of hypnosis. Mike?
Good to be here again, broadcasting from Toronto, Canada, which is the epicenter of world hypnosis. We need you to come study here.
Yes, we do. So thanks everyone again for tuning in for session number 3. We've had an absolutely phenomenal reception so far on session number 1, session number 2, and even our
Flood
beta.
of emails.
Yeah, floods of emails, lots of questions, lots of people asking about how do you do the acid test. We'll get to that later.
That, yes.
And if you haven't heard or listened to that podcast number 2 yet, then
you need to.
You absolutely need to, so that today's will make sense for you. So I would love to remind you all to head on over to iTunes, leave your comments, leave your ratings, and feel free to send us questions. We set up a dedicated email address, which is questions@MikeMandelHypnosis.com. You can send us your questions, and we'll answer them on future podcasts. Mandel has one L. So today, let's begin. Mike.
What do we got today, Chris?
Well, we've been getting questions about hypnosis, and one of the most common questions has been, can you hypnotize a strong-willed person? And I think this is probably a good topic for both the therapeutic environment, and then later I'm going to ask you a little bit about how to use influence and persuasion on strong-willed people.
Okay, this is a good question. How do you hypnotize a strong-willed person? This is a recurrent theme, and I think it comes from this mythology that willpower is something to do with how the hypnotic state is generated, because the old style of authoritarian hypnosis popularized by Franz Anton Mesmer and Braid and so on was that hypnotist does action or says something to subject and trance results. Therefore, the entire psychodynamic interchange is formed as though it were some sort of cause and effect thing, as though the hypnotist is wrestling with the will of the subject and attempting to dominate it in a Svengali-esque sort of sense. The reality is, we know from the Ericksonian method that hypnosis is a complex relationship between the hypnotist and the subject, and subjects who are poorly educated as to what hypnosis is will tend to believe it's a battle of wills, and that if they just grit their teeth and don't look at you or fight back with their willpower, that somehow they will prevail and you won't be able to hypnotize them. But in reality, willpower has very, very little to do with it. Just the willpower might get you to the office in the first place and make you determine that you wish to change in some way. Willpower, of course, does show up in handwriting. As any good graphologist will tell you, it's indicated in the length and weight of the T-bars on the small letter T. The longer will indicate more enthusiasm, and the heavier weight of the stroke will indicate greater willpower. So that being said, someone with a strong will can still be a phenomenal hypnotic subject if one recalls that all hypnosis is self-hypnosis. When I would do therapy with someone, I would always indicate to them, you are not only your best therapist, you are your only therapist. The Mandel model of therapy states that your subject is stuck in a labyrinth, and you cannot kill the minotaur for them or drag them out, but you can enter the labyrinth with them and illuminate the pathway and lead them out, but they still have to walk out of the maze.
So it sounds to me like willpower is really a misunderstanding when it comes to am I hypnotizable because I have strong willpower, and what you're doing is a reframing exercise with the client and helping them understand that their willpower helps them go into trance.
Right, and again we must recall that essentially hypnosis is going to engage imagination and emotions and more right brain hemispheric function. Willpower doesn't have a chance against these things. If you put a plank on the floor, and the plank is a foot wide and 10 feet long, and you ask someone to walk along this plank back and forth, they will do so with no difficulty whatsoever. But if you place that same plank between two buildings, 500 feet high, 50 stories, and ask them to walk across, even if there's no breeze whatsoever, they'll get partway over and their brain will start saying, you're going to fall, you're going to fall, you're going to fall, and they will fall. And the imagination will override the ability of their will to utilize the conscious mind in a way that will cause their muscles to function properly. Imagination will win. What I've found with people is I typically hear, well, I can't be hypnotized. They say, well, I can get most people in about 15 seconds. They say, yeah, but I got a really strong mind. I say, good, 10 seconds, because you're the one who does it. So if I can convince you to utilize your will to create a hypnotic state, you'll be all the better because of it.
All right, thanks for that explanation, Mike. Now, let's shift to the topic of influence and persuasion then. If you are dealing with a particularly smart and strong-willed person, Let's talk about how metaphor works in the context of influencing people. I know you have a ton of experience in this. We've talked about this before. Let's talk about how you can use stories to influence people.
Well, it's axiomatic in my model of therapy and communication that it is impossible to tell a story without consequence. There will be a consequence. Stories are a means of accessing tremendous unconscious resources. They will resonate with your life experience and your perceptual filters and beliefs and so on. And a story is a great way of getting to the unconscious mind because it's only a story. And if you start by saying something like, once upon a time, all of a sudden it's a fairy tale and the guard is right down. I've seen people absolutely transformed from hearing a simple story. And it's remarkable. The pattern that we see at work here is the story content entertains the conscious mind and keeps it out of the way. But the story form, the structure of the story, is what goes beneath the surface and works with the unconscious. And then we're working with different types of metaphor here, Chris, from multiple embedded loops to generalized metaphors to just things that work with almost anyone in the sense of a generalized metaphor, to things that are isomorphic and have a one-to-one correspondence. The content matter and the structure. So in other words, stories cause people to change because they occupy the conscious mind and the unconscious mind can do the work beneath the surface.
Okay, now isomorphic metaphor is something that I teach in my Talking to Toddlers audio course to parents, and I think this is maybe a good one to start with for the newbie listeners out there. Maybe you could explain what an isomorphic metaphor is and how it creates change.
An isomorphic metaphor is a metaphor that has a one-to-one correspondence, meaning every event or person or thing in the story will map across to be something in the listener's personal experience. A number of years ago, I was doing NLP training, my initial training in Richard Bandler's system, my practitioner training back in about 1992-93. And at that time, one of the other students was suffering from what NLP people call premature closure. Now, premature closure is this misunderstanding, a belief that you have solved a problem, that you've eliminated all the difficulties, or that you understand something thoroughly, when in reality there's still loose ends hanging, and this man Richard was notorious for that. So Chris Dunkley, the trainer, gave me the task of curing this guy's premature closure by telling him a story, a metaphor. And this is the story I told. Once upon a time, many years ago, there was a beautiful medieval town. And in the town was a clockmaker, a wise old clockmaker, and he would fix clocks of any kind, wristwatches and cuckoo clocks and big chiming grandfather clocks. Well, of course, they didn't exist at that time, but we'll go with the story anyway. And people from the village would come to him and have their clocks repaired, and everyone was thrilled with how well they worked and how reasonable his rates were. Well, along came, as so often happens in these stories, a junior clockmaker who had apprenticed for a while and thought he was just as good as the old expert. Consequently, he managed to draw away a number of the clients by opening his own watch and clock repair shop. And the young clockmaker fixed people's cuckoo clocks and wristwatches and grandfather clocks and was very happy and made a lot of money doing so. Until one day, a wizard came to town. And the wizard wandered into the young clockmaker's shop and, speaking with him, asked him what he did. And he said, well, as you can see, I repair clocks and watches of all kinds, and everyone is happy. And the wizard said, really, let me show you something, and led him into a small courtyard behind the shop, which was filled with people. People with clocks and watches, cuckoo clocks that would not cuckoo, wristwatches that wouldn't wind, and grandfather clocks that wouldn't chime. And the man was amazed because the young clockmaker had fixed all of these, but they weren't running properly. And so he said to the wizard, what should I do? And he said, go and apprentice with the old clockmaker in town, and he will tell you when you are ready to open your own shop. And that he did, and learned consummate skills, courtesy of the old watchmaker clockmaker, and eventually opened his own shop, and everyone truly was happy. Now this is an example of an isomorphic metaphor. Everything maps across. The old clockmaker was the NLP trainer. The young clockmaker, the apprentice, was the guy Richard who with the premature closure. And the wizard, in this case, was me. I'd come into town, had delivered the metaphor, and caused the change. That's isomorphism, a one-to-one correspondence, a story that changes things.
I think it's a wonderful example of an isomorphic metaphor, and I wonder if it's the appropriate podcast to talk about multiple nested loops in metaphors.
Oh, I think we might save that for a future one because there's considerable depth in that. Let's let the isomorphism resonate with our listeners for now, and later we'll talk about stories within stories within stories, multiple embedded loops in a later episode.
I think that's a great idea. Maybe we'll come back to that on episode 4 or 5 or some point, point in the future. But I think if you are, if you're interested in learning about therapeutic metaphors, because stories really can change people, nested loops are a fantastic tool to learn, and Dr. Mandel is the one to teach it to you. So let's move on then. And I mean, you've just given us a wonderful example of where you've used metaphors, and I had that on my question list. I wanted to come back to something we've talked about. I think this was on our beta podcast before we launched it into iTunes. And if you're interested in listening to the beta podcast, by the way, you can head on over to mikemandelhypnosis.com, click on the blog tab, and you'll find a blog post there, which is the the beta podcast, which we called Relationship Mike, because it was Mike's tips on how to maintain a healthy relationship and how to communicate in a healthy relationship. Anyway, at some point on that podcast, we talked about an experience you had where you were walking away from a show and a student followed you down the hallway and
the headache,
asking you about how to eliminate a headache, or if hypnosis would work to eliminate a headache. And I believe that you did a simple submodality shift with him. Am I correct in saying that?
Absolutely correct.
And so for the benefit of listeners who don't know what that means, the headache is a form of pain, of course, that takes place in the kinesthetic system. It's an internal feeling that we have. And if we shift those feelings into other representational systems, for example, the visual system, we can change them and then reinstall them into the kinesthetic system, and the feeling will be different.
That's right, Chris. We're basically saying it is very, very hard to change your pain directly because you're dealing with something that's very pressing and very painful, which is why we call it pain. But if you change it into a visual representation, then it's easy to shift it in the visual representation. When you put it back in the kinesthetic representation, it will have changed. And if I'm not mistaken, you just did this on someone the other night.
That's exactly what I wanted to talk about, because I followed your model to a T, and with my own little changes just to suit the circumstances, because I think you have to calibrate every person, as you've taught me very well. And I happened to be sitting there at the bar the other night having a beer, catching up with my friend Steve, and we were talking about this podcast because I was telling him how we just started this podcast. He asked me about hypnosis and if it could help with a headache. I asked him if he had a headache. He said yes, that he did. I asked him how it felt on a scale of 1 to 10, subjective units of distress. Again, so you've communicated that over and over, that when you're starting with a problem that is painful, find out on a scale of 1 to 10, how painful is it? And he indicated his headache was a 3. So that's a mild discomfort. It would definitely annoy you, and you wouldn't want to sit there having a conversation over beers when you were suffering from a headache. So I simply asked him to close his eyes and describe to me where the headache was. Then I asked him to tell me if he could imagine pretending what color the headache was, what color would it be? And he told me it was black. So I asked him to dissociate, to remove the headache from his mind, almost to imagine an X-ray image of his own head in front of him, and he could see that black headache. I then asked him to tell me what color he would rather the headache be. He told me gray. So I had him reach out in front of him and just turn down that brightness dial until it was the most appropriate level of gray for him. And then I asked him to put it back inside his head and notice how it felt. And he looked at me, he opened his eyes, and he said, "It was throbbing a minute ago. What the heck's going on? That was weird." And he didn't believe it. I almost didn't believe it myself because it was such a rapid change. But he said, "Let's just keep talking, and I'll let you know if it's still gone in a couple of minutes." And we kept on talking, and probably about 10 minutes later, he just interrupted what we were talking about and said, "I can't believe it. What the heck is going on? I mean, this headache's just gone. It was throbbing a few minutes ago, and I just can't believe that it went away that simply. I mean, can I do that myself?" And so what do you think? Can people do that to themselves, or do they really need someone there to guide them through the process, Mike?
Well, maybe initially you need someone to guide you through the process, but after that, obviously, it's something that can be done on your own, and that was beautifully done, Chris. What I particularly like about the intervention you used is, if I'm correct in what you're saying, you had him reach out with his hand and physically turn this knob down. By having the client slash subject slash patient actively involved in their own trance phenomena, you get a much, much stronger effect.
Sort of reminds me of Cialdini's rule of commitment and consistency.
Yes, absolutely. Dr. Cialdini's book, Influence, is a phenomenal one that everybody needs to read just to find out how much manipulation is going on all around us all the time. But another really nice way of eliminating pain really quickly, and again, we don't say you should wholesale just get rid of pain. You don't know what disease the person may have. Always check with their doctor first. But another nice way of getting rid of pain is I would put the person in a trance, have them imagine they're looking at themselves in a mirror and staring at the image in the mirror and saying, and where is the pain now? Or did it just disappear? And dissociating from the pain with the mirror will usually, and again, of course, that's most of the time, 51%, will usually cause it to disappear immediately.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've noticed that myself, as dissociation tends to be a very powerful effect, where if you take it from being internally associated and dissociated, it just feels very, very different.
Absolutely, and dissociation is a major part of hypnosis all the time anyway.
And in fact, the same thing is true with any kind of trauma, isn't it? I mean, if you have a traumatic memory and you were to dissociate from it, meaning that you see it as if
it's external to you?
As if it's external, as opposed to as if the camera is coming through your own eyeballs, it feels very different.
Yes, if you experience something by looking at yourself in the image, it's much less emotionally intense than something is if you're inside your own shoes in the image.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of NLP edits that are based on dissociation, in fact.
Absolutely.
Which we'll talk about on another podcast.
Yes, we will.
Yes. Okay, so let's move along. What do we got next here, Mike? We talked about headaches. We talked about metaphors. I want to ask you about hypnosis and some of the most interesting things that you've done, but I know you've spent so much of your career doing stage hypnosis, and more recently you've been doing a lot of keynote presentations and stuff like that. But off stage, when you had a practice, what are some of the most impressive changes that you witnessed clients making?
Well, it's very, very interesting to me that sometimes just building in sufficient generative change, building in enough resource states, will get rid of problem things. It's as though building enough strength just immediately deletes all the bad stuff. But having said that, it's still my favorite model to say that we should de-traumatize first, get a clean slate before we start building in resource states. But some of the most amazing things can happen very, very quickly. I had a woman come in for therapy who had classic post-traumatic stress disorder, had a history of sexual abuse for a number of years as a child, just an absolute mess. And she'd been in classical, traditional therapy for about 12 years, and working with her in just one session, her post-traumatic stress disorder completely disappeared with all the associated gastrointestinal problems and back pain and all the other things, the nightmares and flashbacks that went with it, just vanished. And that's really a very, very common thing.
So she had post-traumatic stress disorder, and once you cleaned up the traumatic state and installed positive resources, all kinds of physiological problems disappeared?
Physiological problems disappeared as well, which must have had a psychogenic cause.
That is remarkable. I mean, truly it is. So, you know what? I think in the future I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit more about that stuff, because there's just so much interesting stuff that can change within your mind and within your body.
Well, yeah, I mean, think about it, Chris. We're talking about the brain having access even to free-floating blood cells. We know there's something essentially like tiny antennae that are on free-floating lymphocytes and so on that are in the bloodstream but are still communicated with by the human brain. And if we can cause clots to develop in tooth sockets after a secondary molar is removed directly in response to a powerful hypnotic suggestion, the blood stops at the top of the tooth socket, forms a clot. We're getting an aggregation of platelets that are forming a webbing, bonding together and creating a clot purely in response to suggestion. Now, how are the blood cells hearing that suggestion? I think the most remarkable medical example I have ever heard was Dr. Michelle Bodner, who's a naturopath and also a doula. She worked with a lot of women in the birthing process, used hypnosis and homeopathy extensively, and I know the story firsthand or secondhand very closely because she's my niece. And she is a phenomenal hypnotist. She got some of the genetics. And she told me about a case where the mother, who was about to give birth, there was a problem with the birth insofar as the umbilical cord was around the baby's neck. And I don't know if it was a breech birth, but the cord was tightening around the baby's neck as they were endeavoring to have the baby emerge. And rather than doing a cesarean, Michelle had the woman put in a deep trance, a woman who had experienced hypnosis with her on many occasions. Remember, trance is a learning state. And she commanded the baby, which of course doesn't understand English, commanded the baby to turn around in the womb and untangle the cord, and it did. Just absolutely remarkable stuff.
Which I think really just goes to show that we can't truly explain how it all works yet. We're still learning about the limits of hypnosis.
That's right. We don't know where we hit the wall, but if we keep just pretending there isn't a wall, we will hit it eventually. We just haven't hit it yet.
Makes sense. The next question I had for you is about on-stage therapy. And I remember, you can tell the story here, but I would love to hear you tell the story about how you used hypnosis to cause covert change during a stage show at, there was a school where...
Oh, the racist case.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Let's call it the stage hypnosis and covert racism cure.
Yes, there we go. I know the one you're speaking of. This would be about 1981. I was touring the southern U.S. doing a university tour, so I was all through Texas and Arkansas and Louisiana, and I can't remember exactly where the university was. I think it was in Louisiana, and a bunch of people were gathered around the afternoon. There weren't a lot of people doing stage hypnosis shows back then, and they were saying, oh, we want to volunteer. He wants to volunteer. Is he going to go up on stage? And there was quite a buzz. And the show was done in a theater in the college or university, whichever it was, and two guys, as part of the group, we had 35 volunteers on stage, two guys who came up, one black, one white, I'm saying blackest of black and whitest of white, absolutely hated each other. They were both racists. One was like the main guy on the basketball team, the captain or something of that nature. I don't understand basketball, so I'm guessing. The other guy was this white skinhead, white supremacist type, and they hated each other, seeing each other as absolutely representative of everything in the world they did not like. Well, as it turned out, they both went into powerful trance states. And back then I was very experimental. And I changed both of their races. I made the black guy white and the white guy black and got them to debate with each other. And what was astounding was the black guy could be just as racist against his own black brothers, and the white guy could be just as racist against his white supremacist friends as they had been against each other. They could adopt the other person's view just as powerfully and ripped each other apart, having switched races. And then I snapped them out of it, and there was just abject silence in the theater, and then everybody started going nuts. And I think it taught a valuable lesson.
Now, these guys obviously went through a period of integration right there on stage, where they integrated what they had just been saying and doing.
One can only hope that it lasted, but there was a stunned look on their faces, I think, when they recognized consciously what they had done and how they could just as congruently argue the other guy's side, which really shows how ludicrous racism is to begin with. I believe in one race. I support only one race, the human race. There's more variation between individual so-called races than there are between races. Races are a nonsensical thing genetically anyway. They really don't exist.
I think that's a beautiful story. I mean, yeah, I hope that these guys remain changed to this day, because that is absolutely powerful thing to have happen.
And startling when it indicates the power of hypnosis, how they could so radically alter their own views.
And I think, in talking about how you won't do anything against your internal belief system,
your moral code.
So these guys really must have, on a deep internal level,
doubted it.
Really must have understood that this was all a bunch of crap, and that
the racism that they held. Yeah, yes. I think so.
That's awesome. Okay, so Mike, we're going to be closing this out soon, and before I get you to give the closing metaphor for
the acid test,
yes,
you tell how the acid
you
test
gotta
is
tell us how the acid test is done.
If you haven't heard podcast number 2, you need to listen to it before you hear this. Anyway, the basic idea was I had 5 beakers, half full of liquid. 1 contained nitric acid. They were in front of a sheet of plexiglass numbered 1 to 5. So if you move the glasses around, their numbers would change by virtue of which number they were in front of. Someone comes up, mixes them up. I'm the only one who knows which one has the acid, but now my back is turned. I'm heavily blindfolded, so I never turn around. The person mixes them all up behind a screen. So even if anyone from the audience is a confederate of mine and could signal me somehow covertly, they can't even see which is which. So only the person mixing them knows which ones they've mixed, if at all. They might have just clinked them around. And nobody now knows which one contains the nitric acid. I begin by calling out numbers and building the suspense and drinking 3 of them till there's only 2 left. And say, you always go with your first impression, give me glass number 4. No, 5, or whatever, however I did it. And everyone freaks out, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. And I hold the glasses. I'm trying to build up the tension and get my nerve up. And I gulp down the last glass and then smile at the audience. They realize it's not nitric acid. And there's a big round of applause. And then I get the remaining glass and dump it in a beaker that is full of old bits of scrap metal and keys and, nuts and bolts and so on. And they start to dissolve and go crazy with heat and burning up. And we rapidly dump it into a bucket of water. Well, how do you avoid the nitric acid flawlessly so this isn't as dangerous as it could be? It sounds a lot more dangerous than it is, because the actual danger level is not, since I'm drinking 4 of them, it's not 80% chance that I would drink nitric acid. It's actually 0% chance. This is a flawless effect. It's built-in safeguards. It's impossible to be hurt doing this because all of the glasses contain water. There is no nitric acid. The trick is in the scrap metal. The misdirection draws everyone's attention to the glasses as though one of them contains acid. It's sold very strongly so people believe one of them contains acid. The scrap metal contains, amidst the scrap metal, calcium metal turnings, which look like scrap metal. Calcium, you remember your chemistry, Chris, you put water on it, it goes insane and begins to dissolve, immediately generating incredible heat. It looks like an acid reaction. So when the water is poured in, the calcium begins to react. With all the turmoil in the beaker, it looks like everything is dissolving. The person picks it up. They can feel the heat through the glass. They dump it in the water, and then if anyone finds the scrap metal in the bucket, it's just the stuff that didn't dissolve yet.
Oh, so it's still an exothermic reaction.
Exothermic reaction, but nothing whatever to do with nitric acid. Never had it fail, and absolutely freaks some people out. So somebody go and do it and tell me how well it works.
So is all mentalism a big lie then?
Pretty much,
It's
yes.
just about
Hate to
setting it up.
disappoint anyone, but it pretty well is.
Well, I know, Mike, in the future, you've got so many mentalism effects to talk about. So we will ask you, the listeners, to write in. And if you've seen Mike do a show and want to know how something's done, feel free to ask.
But before you say anything, Chris, let me give you a 40-second closing metaphor.
Yes, let's talk about the closing metaphor.
Once there was a man, and this man had a belonging that he enjoyed, something that was important to him because it was passed down in his family. It was a set of knives and forks made of silver. Knives, forks, and spoons, silverware, in a knife drawer. But he wanted a new house, and he wanted to live in a new area because he didn't like where he was. He wanted to be nearer the shopping area. So he found an old house and bought the property and had a wrecking ball come in and had the house knocked down to the ground. And he had a construction company come around and build a brand new foundation. And the last thing he moved into the new house was all the silverware.
That's the whole metaphor?
That's it.
All right, well, everyone, let that integrate. Let that create change inside of your own unconscious mind. And we will close out the show by saying, this has been
Dr. Mike Mandel
and Brain Software
with Chris Thompson.
Episode number 3. Now, you can head on over to MikeMandelHypnosis.com. Make sure you give us your name and email address, and we'll get you on our email list. We'll send you lots of really interesting Q&A emails with Dr. Mike Mandel. And we will also be sending you Mike's Brain Software ebook just as soon as it's finished, as well as a series of videos that we're working on. Also, as a reminder, head over to iTunes and leave a rating for Brain Software with Dr. Mike Mandel. Give us your honest feedback, leave a star rating, and write a review. Thanks, everyone. I'm Chris Thompson, and this has been Session 3 of Brain Software with Dr. Mike Mandel. Mike, take us out with the Stratocaster.